Lord's Day, we're going to look at four of these, last of these 6 commands. And as I pointed out when we began, these are really things that is our duty toward one another. What God wants us, or how God wants us to interact with one another. And we might even say what we owe each other. Now, when you look through the 10 commandments, what you'll find is that a lot of these commandments are negative in nature. In other words, they're things that say, do not do this. In fact, I think, are there only 2 that are positive in nature that you find there in those 10 commandments? But, of course, they're telling us things that we shouldn't do, things that are wrong. And I want you to stop for a moment and kind of think about this question. Have you ever just stopped to think about the question, why are these things wrong? And I know we say, well, God said they were, and that makes them wrong, and that's true. But think about why God has forbidden these things, doing these things while we interact with one another. And what I want to emphasize to you is it's not like these were things that God has just recently told us don't do this. These were things that from the beginning of humanity, from the creation of Adam and Eve, God has always told human beings, don't do this when you interact with one another. And so what we learn about these things, and of course I want to re-emphasize as we begin this morning, we don't do these things because we're under the law of Moses and we read about them in Exodus chapter 12. We practice them because they're still in effect under the law of Christ in the New Testament. And so there's still things that God wants His people to do or not to do whenever we interact with one another. And if you stop and you really think about these things, I think what we can logically deduce is this. There's no way that the laws of our universe and our interacting with one another, there's no way that we could do these things and still have a good relationship. In other words, think about this idea. In what period of history could one person steal from another and it not be considered a big deal? In what period of human history could you ever look back and say, if one person killed another person, no hard feelings, I know that was my brother or my mom or my dad, but we're good, we're square. In what period of time could you ever look back and read about or think about a person committing adultery with another person's spouse and, 2 friends and they say, well, we're still friends, it's no big deal. Think about the idea of lying about somebody else. In what period of human history could you ever look at those and say, it wouldn't affect our relationship with one another? And so what we have to understand is these things are wrong, and they've always been wrong, and they always will be wrong, because they affect the way that we interact with one another. And if we don't do these things, then what's going to happen is you just can't have a good human relationship here upon this earth if you're going to disobey these laws. And so that's what I want us to think about this morning as we look through this. If we are going to get along with one another as Christians, and if we are going to get along with people in the world, these are some things that we should not do in order to promote human relationships. Well, the first one actually begins with something that we should do. It's one of those positives about these commandments. And you just read this statement simply in Exodus 20 and verse 12, where God told His people to honor thy father and thy mother. And then He gives a reason why to the children of Israel. He said that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. The first, we skipped last week, we looked at do not kill. That's actually the 6th commandment. Honor your father and your mother is the 5th one. So we're kind of backing up here. But this is the first of those 6 commandments that have to do with our interaction with one another, our relationship with mankind. And what is kind of interesting to me, what God begins with is He begins with the family relationship. I want you to think about the importance of that. Listen, if we can't get human relationships right in our own family, how are we ever going to get it right with anybody else? And so it's part of the basis of interacting with one another. And we should interact with one another within our family. That should be one of the easiest things for us to do, to treat them in a very honorable way. So we have to understand what God's saying here. The word honor just simply means esteem, respect, or reverence. And I kind of want to draw to your attention, we're living in a world today where this idea of honoring and respecting, especially those who are aged, is almost foreign. You might even think that some people, when they read about the idea of honoring your father and your mother, not just thinking about it from a youth perspective, but from an aged perspective, when our mothers and our fathers progress in age and they get to the point where, physically they're just not the same like they were, that there's some honor that we owe to them. There's some duty, some reverence and respect that we owe to each one of them. But we live in a world where if it was up to some people, you know what they would say about the aged, or if you talk about Dennis, the old people? They'd say, let's just do away with it. Let's just eliminate them altogether, right? Because old people don't do anything for society. In fact, they're a drain on society. You have to take time and money and attention, and they just don't, they're not doing anything to profit and to build up our society. But isn't that the way that some people think today when it comes to those who are aged? Well, it's interesting that God taught his people, the Jews, to respect age and to care for their senior citizens, for lack of a better term. But, you think about that, that was true about any of the aged and any of those who were well advanced in years, but it was especially true about their own, wasn't it? It was especially true about their own family. And here's what I want us to think about today. Maybe those of us who are looking toward the future, and what we're realizing is one day we're going to be in that category, and it may be sooner than later, but the idea of old age, how do you want to be treated when you're in that area? Because the way that we treat people today in that category is the way that we're going to be treated when we get there. You reap what you sow. That's what the Bible tells us. And so the way that we treat them today is going to determine the way that we're going to be treated tomorrow. And what the Bible tells us is there's some honor and there's some respect and reverence that are due to those. What does that mean? Well, if you've ever heard me talk about this commandment, you know that basically I talk about it in two ways. The first one is from the perspective of youth. What this commandment means when you're a young child within the home of your mother and your father is that you listen to them and you obey them. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1, that's exactly what Paul would say when he said, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." I'm really concerned as an individual, and the older I get, the more concerned I become with this, the kind of extreme that we've gone to in our society when it comes to our youth. And what I mean by that statement, I think maybe, I know in times past, there was this old adage that you used to hear all the time. Our children are better seen than heard, right? That's what the old timers always used to say. And that's kind of an extreme, isn't it? It's not that children they should just run off and go away and do their own thing and not interfere or be involved with anybody else. But there's also another extreme to which you can go to where in our world today, young people are almost worshipped. And what I mean by that is, we've kind of readjusted our complete society to say the young person is the most important person in the world, and we want to be like them in every aspect of our life. We want to live carefree like they live, and we want to go out and do whatever we want to do, just like they do. And there's kind of been this mindset, and I'm not talking about necessarily in the church, but in the world, where we adopt this philosophy where young people are really what's most important in life. And I'm not trying to diminish the importance of young people in any way. I want you to understand that. But that's not what the Bible teaches. What the Bible teaches is there should be mutual honor and respect and reverence from age to age to age. And that's true whether we're talking about young people, that's true whether we're talking about middle-aged people, that's true whether we're talking about those who are advanced in years. There's a tremendous honor and respect that we should mutually have for one another. No age group should be more important than the other. No age group should be honored above another age group. And so to me, in our society, we look at our children and we say, why are people so self-centered today? And why why, when they don't get their way, can they not just accept that and not throw a fit and cause a big ruckus? And could it be because of the way that our society views young people and the way that we've treated them throughout these years? Have we spared the rod and spoiled the child? I think the Bible has something to say about that too. And I don't just blame children. I blame us as parents probably just as much as I would as children. But here's what I want all of us to understand. Children have a responsibility. Here's what God says is your responsibility. You need to honor your father and your mother. What does that mean? It means you listen to them and you obey them. But as parents, we have a responsibility to teach our children to honor us. We have a responsibility to teach our children to listen to us and to obey us. And I always remember a sermon. I was sitting in a lectureship some time ago, a number of years ago. I was hearing a younger guy than I was. He was talking about in his sermon. I think this was his passage, maybe even the parent-child relationship, Ephesians 6:1. But he was telling the story. He said, one day he was driving to church. He said, man, the children were in the back seat and they were just going crazy. And he was yelling at them and his wife was yelling at him. And, he got to church and he was just upset because of everything that had gone along. He said, there's an older brother that came up to him. He says, how's it going? He says, going horrible. He said, what do you mean it's going horrible? He said, well, my kids, they were ridiculous on the way over here. And he said the older brother put his arm around him. He said, you know how to fix that, don't you? If we as parents don't teach them honor and respect, who's going to teach them? It's our job, isn't it? And so there's a responsibility that lies upon a parent to teach their child to listen and to obey. But there's also a responsibility upon the children to listen and to obey to their parents. So there is a perspective of this commandment that comes from being a young person. But there's also a perspective that this commandment offers us when it comes to older age. And particularly, what I mean is what this commandment means when your mother and your father, when you're out from under their roof, when they've grown older, you owe them honor and reverence and respect. For the Bible says for what they did for you when you were a kid. How they took care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself. And this was a commandment, again, it's been around since mankind was created. Remember, Jesus was asked about it in Mark chapter 7, verses 10 through 12. And Jesus said this about this commandment and the way that people of his day and age, even the Jews, viewed it. He said, Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, if a man shall say to his father, it is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother. You see, the Jews had come up with a way to circumvent this commandment, and basically their attitude was this: we don't want to spend all of our money taking care of our mom and dad when they get older. We want to keep our money for ourselves, and so how do we do that? We say our money is devoted to God. And since we vowed it as a gift to God, that means we can't take God's gift and give it to our mom and our dad, right? That would be wrong. And so we have to hold on to that money. We can't give it away to them. But, think about the idea of paying attention to one another. And attentiveness is one of those things it's going to take place all along the road of life. But it shouldn't end when our parents get older. Have you ever visited a nursing home or retirement home before, or, a recovery home? And, I'm not saying these things are bad in any way. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. Because there are certain situations where they're necessary. Just an unfortunate part of life. But here's what I do want to say that doesn't have to happen. How many times have you seen an older person placed in one of those facilities and their family never goes to see them again? Is that the honor that's due to those people? Is that the type of reverence that we're supposed to show for our mother and our father who raised us and took care of us and brought us up? The Bible teaches us that it's important to pay attention to our parents. And think about how difficult that has to be for an aged individual. I can't imagine, as is the case as our parents often grow older, to be removed from your home setting, something you've known and lived in your entire life, to be removed from your family, to be cut off from the places and the people that you've known and interacted with for so long. Listen, that has to be a difficult thing to experience, doesn't it? But to be stuck in a place where those who should love you the most never even come and see you, never even come and pay attention to you, never even come to check on you, it's not the way it's supposed to be. And so, when our parents get older, are they still important? Absolutely. Do they still deserve our attention? Absolutely. Just like they deserved our attention when we were young. And in fact, they probably need it more than ever before. Paul made the statement in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 21. He was actually specifically writing about the husband and the wife relationship. But he said, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. I know in the next chapter, chapter 6, Paul continues on. He talks about the parent-child relationship. But I want you to think about that idea of submission from the standpoint of relationships. And that's what it takes to have good relationships with others, doesn't it? It takes this idea of mutual honor and reverence and respect for one another. Doesn't matter if you're young, doesn't matter if you're old, doesn't matter if you're middle-aged, if you're a man or if you're a woman, what nationality you are, what income bracket you fall into. It takes mutual honor and respect from one another. And that's what the family unit is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a unit where everybody is important. Not one above another, but everybody. Where everyone is allowed to speak. Not just one person. Where everybody is loved, where everybody is appreciated, where everybody is counted precious. And that's the pattern that God has given us for the Christian home. And that's the foundation of a good family relationship. People honoring and respecting one another mutually because of their commitment to Christ. But what I want to point out to you is it's not just the foundation for the family relationship. It's the foundation for every human relationship. If we don't have mutual honor and respect for one another, if one person thinks they are better or more valuable than another, we're not going to have a good human relationship, are we? And so think about the importance of this command. The second idea that I want us to think about this morning, and it falls within a particular command, but I want to talk more about it from the standpoint of a principle, and that is the idea of holding marriage as an institution, having high regard for marriage. Having high regard for the marriage relationship. And this is the commandment that it's personified in Exodus 20 and verse 14. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That seventh commandment, it addresses the issue of sexual purity in marriage. And of course, adultery, which is unlawful sexual intercourse, adultery within the realm of marriage, it's a violation of the sexual conduct that's supposed to take place within the confines of marriage. What it displays is a lack of respect for one's mate. We know, I don't know what the exact numbers today are on divorce, but I can tell you this, adultery or sexual unfaithfulness is one of the leading causes of divorce. It may not be number one, but it's up there in the top. You just can't act that way and keep a family together. You just can't disrespect one another like that and expect everything to work out in the end. And so how does the Bible address this? Well, one of the things it tells us is it's like anything else. If you're going to overcome or defeat adultery, you've got to start at the root, don't you? You've got to defeat something at a root. It's just like you ever had those dumb thorn trees, you go out and you cut them off and you think, I got them now. Problem with thorn trees is this. They have deep roots, and they have strong roots, and you may cut it off, but every probably foot or two, it's going to shoot up another tree or another sprout, and it's going to keep growing. You got to deal with these things from the root up if you want to really defeat them and destroy it. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 5, 27 and 28. He says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery." What did the law address? Just the physical act? Is that how you're going to overcome it? Just don't do it? Jesus says in verse 28, "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." Jesus went beyond just the mere act of adultery itself, and he really went to the root of what causes adultery. And what he talks about there in verse 28 is, he said, it's about looking upon another person with lust in your heart. Don't look on another person with lust in your heart, you won't have a problem with adultery. But if you're going to be looking at other people with lust in your heart, guess what's going to happen in your marriage relationship? Adultery is going to come to fruition, isn't it? And so Jesus talked about the idea that if you want to avoid adultery, just don't look at other people. That's basically what he said, right? Now, I've said this before, and I understand sometimes as humans, you see something that you shouldn't have seen that you can't unsee, right? But I always say this, you don't have to look again. You don't have to stare. You don't have to reminisce on the things, the images that you saw that you shouldn't have. Sometimes that just happens in life. I don't think those are the things that Jesus is specifically talking about here. But I want you to think about that idea. Don't look. When we live in excuse my frankness, a sex-saturated culture, where the idea of lust is implanted in our minds almost on a daily basis. It's implanted through images. It's implanted through words. I'm always amazed when I tell you before, I don't watch a whole lot of TV. Well, I do watch quite a bit, but sports is my main thing. I don't like commercials. Okay, if I've got a sporting event, even the Chiefs game tonight, I'm not going to watch it in real time. I just don't like the commercials. But every once in a while, I give up and I sit there and waste 3.5 hours and watch all the commercials. But I'm always amazed at how almost every commercial has some kind of sexual innuendo in it. I'm talking about things like food. I mean, we're not talking about obvious things. If your mind is not already in the gutter, they want to pull it down there, don't they? They want to implant these thoughts and these minds and these ideas within our hearts. And what Jesus tells us about this is you can't look on those things. You can't spend time with those ideas and those things and think everything is going to come out okay in the end. And so we have to understand that if we're going to overcome adultery, then we're going to have to deal with the root of the problem, not just the commandment itself. What the Bible does teach us about adultery is it's very serious business in the eyes of God. I wouldn't say it's serious business in the eyes of the world today, would you? In fact, it's probably one of the most common accepted sins in our society. But that doesn't mean that God views and feels about it the same way that we do. In fact, when you go back to the law of Moses, remember in Leviticus 20 and verse 10, here was what the law of Moses said about it. And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. That's pretty stiff, isn't it? Why would God be so infuriated? Why would God see fit that when something like this happened under the law of Moses, again, we don't live under the law of Moses today, I'm good with that, I'm thankful for that. But why would he have such a stiff penalty under the law of Moses? And the answer is, it's really simple. Listen, the family unit is the basis of society. It's the basis of nations. It's the basis of our world. And if you do away with the family unit, you've done away with morality. You've done away with any idea of what you want to do with your lusts and your desires is okay. And so God knew that from the beginning. And God says you cannot allow this to happen. If you do allow this to happen, it's going to be a serious thing. In Deuteronomy 22 and verse 22, if a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die. Both the man that lay with a woman and the woman, so shalt thou put away evil from Israel. I don't have time to go back to the Old Testament law, but you can go back and verify that what I'm saying is true. The laws that we have in effect, or that we're reading about here, of course, had to do with consensual acts. They had nothing to do with forced acts. There's a different law along those lines. But this was the law of God. And the crime, in God's eyes, this crime was so serious that it was to be dealt with capital punishment. That's what God thought about. And so it is serious business, and it is certainly serious business in the eyes of God. The importance to our marriage contract cannot be overemphasized. And here's also what I want to emphasize. It has to do with our view of marriage and the relationship, doesn't it? That's really what this law is about. It should be important. The contract that we made with our spouse should be important to us, but it's not just that. The contract that other people made with their spouses should be important to us too. And so we need to be careful when it comes to this command. Here's what the Bible tells us about adultery, and this isn't a news flash by any means, but just tells us in straightforward words, adultery is not going to go unpunished. God's not going to overlook it. He's not going to turn a blind eye. He's not going to turn his face and look away and say, oh, no big deal, right? In fact, when Paul wrote about it in 1 Thessalonians 4, you can read verses 1 through 8. I'm just going to start in verse 3. Here's what Paul wrote. I'm reading from a different version here. I do that from time to time. Just saves me a little bit of time so I don't have to try to explain everything. But in verse 3, here's what it says. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each one of you should learn to control his own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the heathen who do not know God, and that in this manner no one should wrong his brother or take advantage of him. The Lord will punish men for all such sins, as we have already told you and warned you. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. Therefore, he who rejects this instruction does not reject man, but God. Do you know one of the important principles that God emphasizes to us as Christians today? It's sexual purity. And I know we live in a society, and I know we live in a world today where people look at that idea as old-fashioned, as unrealistic. But let me tell you this, it's not old-fashioned to God. It's not unrealistic in the eyes of God, is it? In fact, when Paul was writing to the church here at Thessalonica, he said, this is the will of God. Is there any higher will than God's will? And if it's God's will, shouldn't we do our best to try to live that out in our lives? What's God's will? Avoid sexual impurity. Avoid deviation from what he tells us to do. Avoid fornication. Avoid adultery. Avoid homosexuality. All those things that talked about in the Bible. And here's what Paul says in verse 8. Therefore, he who rejects this instruction does not reject man, but God. A lot of people today would reject the idea of sexual purity, wouldn't they? But here's what Paul says. The person who's rejecting this is rejecting God. And you know that's why he says, or in my opinion, I guess I should say, that's why he says in verse 6, the Lord will punish men for all such sins. You can go over to the book of Proverbs. Solomon had a lot to write about marriage. Read the Song of Solomon sometime if you've never read it. He had a lot to write about women, and he knew a few things about women, mostly bad things, but he did know some things about women. But here's some instructions that he left for us in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 6, beginning verse 20, it says, my son, keep your father's commandments, and do not forsake your mother's teachings. Bind them upon your heart forever. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will speak to you. For these commandments are a lamp, this teaching is a light, and the corrections of discipline are the way of life. Solomon's writing about, especially I think from the standpoint of a young person, when it comes to relationships, and when it comes to what you should do and what you shouldn't do, listen to what your parents tell you. Listen to advice that your mother and your father give to you. And if you have good parents, and if you have a good mother and a good father, here's what they're going to tell you. I feel sorry for my family because I always, one person says, if you come in the life of a preacher, you're an illustration whether you like it or not. But Josh can verify this. You know what I tell Josh? I say, stay away from evil and immoral women. They're trouble. Doesn't matter how beautiful they are. Doesn't matter how googly-eyed they are when they look at you. You got to stay away from them. And that's what Solomon's writing about here. Saying, listen to the instruction of your mother and your father. In verse 24, he says, keeping you from the immoral woman, from the smooth tongue of the wayward wife. Do not lust in your heart after her beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes. For the prostitute reduces you to a loaf of bread, and the adulteress preys upon your very life. Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. Again, I think about Solomon writing these words, but basically he's saying this: know the consequences that come with sexual impurity. Know the consequences that come with adultery. Know the consequences that come with fornication. And here's what Solomon says. It's a saying we have in our society. If you're going to play with fire, what's going to happen? You're going to get burned, aren't you? It's unavoidable. And so here's what we have to understand when it comes, especially if we're talking about the area of adultery. Some people say, well, can't you be forgiven of adultery? Yeah. I mean, it's not a question of can God forgive sin. Can God forgive murder? Can God forgive any sin? Absolutely. That's not the question that we need to think about. The question is this: is there punishment that comes with this sin? And I'm not just talking about final punishment. There's no doubt that comes with that. God says, I'll deal with those people. They're not going to go unpunished. But is there punishment in this life? Are there consequences that are born because of adultery? Broken relationships, broken homes. And not only that, but think about the biblical teaching of the lifelong consequences that the guilty party has to deal with. Namely, they can never remarry. Are there serious consequences that go with it? Yes. And so what we have to understand is it's not a sin that's going to go unpunished. In Hebrews 13:4, Paul wrote there, well, if he's the Hebrew writer, marriage is honorable in every way, so husbands and wives should be faithful to each other. God will judge those who commit sexual sins, especially those who commit adultery. What's this commandment about? It's about the way we view marriage. We have to hold marriage in high honor. We have to respect the sanctity of the marriage relationship. Not just our marriage, but others too. And that should be reflected in our purity when it comes to the expressions of our sexuality. You think about these commandments. Are they important when it comes to getting along with one another? These are absolute imperatives. They've been essential from the beginning of time. They're still essential today. They're tremendous laws that tell us if we want to interact with one another and have good relationships with one another, here's some things you should do. Well, I guess we just have one thing we should do. A lot of things you shouldn't do. I hope you come back with us tonight. We'll talk, Lord willing, about a couple more of these commands. Maybe there's one here, though, in our audience this